There is a moment I return to almost every time I stand in front of something I have built. Not because it brings me joy, not because it reminds me of how far I have come, in any way that feels clean or triumphant. I return to it because it was the moment something in me quietly closed, the way a window closes against approaching weather, and never really opened again the same way. I was 16 years old, standing at the front of a classroom at Harlow Preparatory Academy, holding a poster board I had spent 11 days constructing. The fluorescent lights above me buzzed faintly. The air smelled like dry erase markers and someone's expensive cologne. And Cameron Prescott, sitting in the second row with his blazer unbuttoned and his chair tilted back at an angle that only people who have never been told to sit up straight can manage, looked at me with something that wasn't quite contempt and wasn't quite pity, but was something deeply specific to people who have always known they belong somewhere and want to make sure you know you don't. He said what he said. The room laughed, and I stood there and finished my presentation. That's the part people always find hard to believe when I tell this story. I finished. I didn't cry. I didn't walk out. I stood at the front of that classroom. I pointed to the parts of my poster board that explained the chemical composition of soil contamination in urban runoff environments, and I finished every single sentence I had prepared, but something closed, and I have been living with what that closed thing cost me ever since. I want to go back further first, because the classroom moment only makes sense if you understand what came before it. Most people who hear stories like mine assume the beginning is the humiliation, but the humiliation was never the beginning. The beginning was much quieter than that, and it smelled like motor oil and leftover rice. My father was a mechanic, not a shop owner, not someone who eventually built something, a mechanic who worked for someone else's shop for 23 years, came home with grease under his fingernails that never fully washed out, and was quietly proud of the fact that he was reliable. That was his word for himself, reliable. He said it the way other men say distinguished or successful. He meant it with the same weight. My mother worked as a medical billing coordinator for a pediatric clinic about 4 miles from our house. She had taken some college courses when she was younger, never finished, and had built an entire professional competence from what she described as reading everything they put in front of me and then reading more of it on my own. She was meticulous and careful, and she never, in my entire childhood, seemed bitter about the distance between where she was and where she might have been under different circumstances. We lived in a neighborhood that was not bad exactly, but it was the kind of neighborhood that people with options eventually left. The houses were small and the yards were tended, and on Friday evenings in the summer, you could hear 3 different kinds of music through 3 different open windows. My grandmother lived 4 blocks away in a house she had owned outright since 1987. The year she paid off the last of her mortgage with money saved from 30 years of work as a seamstress and later as an alteration specialist at a department store downtown. I want you to understand something about my grandmother before I go any further, because she is not a side character in this story. She is, in a way I only understood much later, the entire architecture of it. Her name was not important to anyone except us. She was small and deliberate. She wore the same style of house slippers every day and kept her kitchen so clean that you felt slightly ashamed eating in it. She had opinions about everything and expressed them quietly, and if you disagreed with her, you usually discovered within a week or a month or sometimes a year that she had been right. She did not make a show of this. She simply waited. She owned a small piece of land. It was not much to look at. It was a rectangular plot, maybe 40 feet wide by 80 feet deep, that sat at what was then considered an unremarkable corner of our city's south-central district, 2 blocks from a used auto parts store and across the street from a laundromat that had been there since my mother was a child. My grandmother had purchased it in 1979 as a possible future investment, held it through decades of neighborhood flux, kept the property taxes paid, and never sold it. Several people had offered to buy it over the years. She had declined every one of them. "Land doesn't ask you for anything," she told me once when I was maybe 10 years old, sitting in her kitchen while she pressed fabric with an iron so old it had a fabric cord. "You hold on to it long enough, it tells you what it wants to become." I didn't understand what she meant. I stored it anyway, the way children store things, adults say, that feel important but not yet legible. I stored it and moved on. The scholarship to Harlow Preparatory Academy arrived the summer before 9th grade. It was a partial scholarship, 70% tuition reduction, contingent on academic performance, and what the letter described as participation in the school's community enrichment program, which was a polished way of saying that scholarship students were expected to contribute labor to offset the cost of their attendance. For some students, this meant working in the library during lunch. For some, it meant helping with setup and breakdown at school events. For me, it meant the science lab. 3 evenings per week, starting at 5:30 and ending whenever the work was done, which was usually 7, sometimes 7:30. I cleaned and reorganized the biology and chemistry labs on the 3rd floor of the building Harlow Prep called the Academic Sciences Wing, as though they needed to specify that the sciences were academic, as though there were any other kind they might have offered. I wiped down the counters with the approved chemical solution. I disposed of waste materials according to protocol. I inventoried supplies and filled out the requisition forms that the actual science teachers would review and sign in the morning. I washed glassware. I made sure the microscopes were covered with the fitted dust cloths before I left. I was good at it. I was fast and thorough, and I liked the order of it. I liked the way the lab looked when I was done. Surfaces clear, equipment aligned, the particular kind of silence that a clean room has before anyone enters it. But I was the only one who had to be there. That distinction mattered more than I understood at the time. Harlow Prep was, by any honest accounting, a school designed for a particular kind of student. The kind of student who arrived in the morning having slept well in a room of their own, who had eaten a prepared breakfast, whose parents had attended Harlow Prep themselves, and whose older siblings were currently at universities that required a separate application essay just to be considered. The uniforms were not technically mandatory, but were strongly encouraged in the form of an unofficial dress code that everyone understood without being told. The teachers wrote recommendations on thick, cream-colored stationery with the school's crest embossed at the top. The college counselor had been doing this work for 31 years and had personal relationships with admissions deans at 11 schools in the top 20 of any ranking you chose to consult. It was a machine, a particular kind of machine, built to produce a particular kind of outcome for a particular kind of person. I was not that kind of person, and everyone knew it, though the degrees of knowing varied considerably. There were other scholarship students, I should say, that, because it is true, and because the school needed us to exist, needed us, I think, in the way that certain institutions need evidence of their own generosity. There were maybe 12 of us in my entering class of '84, and we found each other not because we sought each other out, but because the social physics of the place sorted us into proximity the way gravity sorts objects by mass. We ate lunch at adjacent tables. We were quietly aware of each other's situations without discussing them directly. There was a kind of solidarity in that silence that I valued without fully recognizing it as a form of protection. The first time I encountered Cameron Prescott properly, not in passing, not as a name on a roster, but as a person actively aware of my existence, was 3 weeks into the fall semester of 9th grade. I was coming down the stairwell from the 3rd floor after finishing in the lab, carrying my backpack and the logbook I was required to fill out and leave. At the front desk on my way out, it was 7:45 in the evening, and the building was mostly empty. A few teachers still in their offices, the security guard at the main desk, who always nodded at me without looking up from his phone. Cameron was in the stairwell with two other boys I would learn were named Tyler Blackwood and Scott Davenport. They were not doing anything specific. They were the way boys who have never had to account for their time are sometimes, occupying space with a kind of casual authority, as though the stairwell existed for the precise purpose of containing them. Cameron looked at the logbook in my hand, then at the cleaning solution stain on the cuff of my jacket that I hadn't noticed until that moment, then at my face. "Lab crew," he said, not cruelly, almost conversationally, the way you'd identify a species you'd seen in a nature documentary. I nodded once and kept moving. He didn't say anything else that evening, but something had been registered between us. Not a conflict, not yet, but a notation. He had filed me into a category, and I had felt the filing happen, and we both knew what that meant in the specific social ecosystem of a place like Harlow Prep. The incidents escalated the way these things always do in private schools, which is to say slowly and with plausible deniability and in ways that left marks that couldn't be photographed. The second incident was in October, during the first formal assembly of the fall semester. These were quarterly events, held in the school's main hall, where students sat by class year and administrators delivered remarks about school values and the importance of community. I was seated in the 9th grade section. Cameron was 3 rows in front of me and to my left. At some point during the head of school's remarks, something about the tradition of excellence that Harlow graduates carry into the world, Cameron turned and looked directly at me with a small, private smile that said, "This tradition, specifically, is not yours." I looked back at him until he turned away. That was the second incident. The third was in November, during the group assignment in AP Environmental Science. Dr. Rivera, who was the best teacher at that school by a considerable distance, had organized us into groups of 4 and assigned us each a different urban environmental challenge to research and present. My group was given soil contamination in urban watersheds, a topic I'd actually read about independently because I found it genuinely interesting, which is something I have never told anyone because it seemed, at the time, like the kind of thing that would be used against me. Cameron was not in my group. His group was across the room, but the classroom was arranged in a way that put our groups in each other's peripheral vision, and when Dr. Rivera moved through the room checking progress, she paused at my group's table for noticeably longer than the others. She asked me specifically about the data I'd found on phosphate runoff in older urban drainage systems. I explained what I'd found. She nodded the way teachers nod when they're actually learning something from a student, which is a specific and rare nod, different from the encouraging nod they give when you're correct about something they already knew. I saw Cameron watching this from across the room. He looked like someone recalculating. The group presentation happened in early December. We had 11 days to prepare. I spent 9 of them actually working on the project and 2 building the poster board that I had decided, maybe misguidedly, to make as thorough and professional as I could. I used the school's color printer, the one in the library that required a special pass, which I had because I'd covered a library shift for Jonathan Bennett, one of the other scholarship students, who'd had a family obligation, and I printed charts and maps and data, visualizations that I'd spent several evenings formatting on the family computer at home. The morning of the presentation, I carried the poster board on the bus. I'd wrapped it in the plastic cover from a dry cleaning bag because it was raining. I arrived at school 40 minutes early, which was not unusual for me, and I set up everything on the table at the front of the room before anyone else arrived. My group presented third. The other 2 groups went first. The first was confident but thin on actual research. The second was polished. 2 of its members were clearly going to be attractive to colleges in a way that had nothing to do with intelligence and everything to do with the packaging of intelligence, which is a different thing. They presented well. Then it was us. I presented the bulk of what we had found, because I had found it, and because my group members, who were not unkind people, had contributed what they could, and were relieved that someone had taken the lead. I went through the data on phosphate contamination, on the cycling of heavy metals in urban soil, on the ways that old industrial sites left chemical legacies in the ground that persisted for generations. I explained what this meant for urban water quality. I referenced 3 peer-reviewed sources. I was thorough. Dr. Rivera was nodding. And then Cameron raised his hand. "I have a question," he said. Dr. Rivera nodded at him. His voice was easy and unhurried. The voice of someone who had never been unsure of whether he was allowed to speak. "I'm just wondering, is this original research? Or did someone get some outside help putting this together?" Dr. Rivera's expression shifted slightly. "What do you mean, Cameron?" "I just mean—" He paused, tilting his head, performing consideration. "The depth of it is impressive, especially given the circumstances." He glanced at me. The glance was brief and entirely deliberate. "I know the lab crew has access to resources that other students don't get. The room had that particular silence that classrooms get when something has happened that everyone understands and no one will explicitly name." Someone laughed. It was a short sound, quickly suppressed, but it happened. "I'm not sure what you're suggesting," Dr. Rivera said, her voice cooler now. "Nothing," Cameron said pleasantly. "Just that some students have advantages others don't. It's worth acknowledging, right? Given the school's commitment to equity." He used the word equity. He used it the way someone picks up a tool from a shelf, not because he understood its weight, but because he knew it would unbalance something. And it did. I stood at the front of the room. I could feel the heat in my face. I could feel the way the room had recalibrated, the way the previous 4 minutes of my presentation had been subtly rescored by what Cameron had just implied, which was not that I had cheated exactly, but that my presence in that room, my competence, my research, was somehow contingent, conditional, suspicious. That I had been admitted out of pity, not merit. That the scholarship student who cleaned the lab had leveraged his lab access to produce something beyond what he could naturally have produced on his own. It was precisely worded enough that it couldn't be directly challenged. It was precisely aimed enough to land where it was supposed to. I finished my presentation, every sentence. I turned back to the poster board, and I pointed to the 3rd chart, and I explained what it showed. And I thanked the class for their attention, and I walked back to my seat. Dr. Rivera addressed Cameron quietly after class. I didn't hear what was said. Nothing formal happened. Nothing was put in writing. Cameron served no consequence. The room had laughed, and the laugh had done its work. And by the time we reached the holiday break, the incident had the particular status of things that are remembered privately by everyone involved, but discussed publicly by no one. I took the bus home in the rain with my poster board under my arm, and sat in the kitchen with my mother while she made dinner and did not say anything about what had happened, because saying it out loud would have required me to feel it in a way I was not yet equipped to manage. I decided that evening that I would do something with what Cameron Prescott had made me feel. I did not know yet what, but I stored the feeling the way my grandmother stored land. The remaining 2.5 years at Harlow Prep were characterized by a discipline I had not previously needed to impose on myself, because I had not previously understood what it was for. I stopped trying to be visible. This was my first and most significant mistake, and I want to explain it carefully because I think most people, hearing this story from the outside, might assume it was the right decision. It looked like the right decision, it felt like the right decision, but it wasn't, and the cost of it would take me years to understand. After the classroom incident, I made myself smaller. I did my work rigorously and submitted it without the quality that might attract attention. I participated in class at the level necessary to maintain my grade requirements. no more. I found ways to answer questions that were technically complete but not memorable. I stopped engaging with Dr. Rivera's invitations to explore material beyond the curriculum. I stopped spending extra time on anything that might distinguish me in the ways that the classroom had distinguished me, before Cameron reframed that distinction as suspicious. I was protecting myself. I understand that now. But what I was actually doing was allowing Cameron Prescott to define the size of the space I was permitted to occupy, and then obeying that definition voluntarily, as though it were a rule. The other thing I did, which compounded the mistake, was pull back from the people around me. Jonathan, Bennett, who had been the closest thing I had to a friend at Harlow Prep, kept trying to include me in things. Study groups, the informal Friday gatherings at the school's common room, conversations about where everyone was applying for college. I deflected. I was polite about it. I said I had work, the lab, homework, family obligations, and most of these things were true, but they were also useful as barriers, and I used them as barriers more than I needed to. By junior year, I had effectively become invisible, which was what I had wanted. But invisible is not the same as safe, and I had confused the two. Cameron, meanwhile, had become something of an institution at Harlow Prep. He was the kind of student who benefits enormously from the specific type of educational environment that rewards performance of confidence over demonstration of actual ability. He wasn't unintelligent. I want to be fair here, because accuracy matters more to me than grievance. But his real talent was knowing how to make his intelligence look like more than it was. He ran for class president junior year and won without difficulty. He organized a fundraiser for a local food bank that got photographed for the school newsletter. He was pleasant to teachers and charming to administrators, and effortlessly cruel to the people he had silently designated as beneath the level of his attention. I watched all of this from a distance I'd carefully constructed. I graduated 8th in my class. I didn't attend the senior awards ceremony. I accepted my diploma at the main ceremony, shook the head of school's hand, and left. Cameron's father, I later found out, gave a substantial donation to the school at the end of our senior year. A building renovation. Something with his family name on a plaque. I thought about that on the bus ride home from graduation, and I thought about it again later that night, and then I stored it next to the other things I had stored, and I went to sleep. University was different. The city planning and sustainable development program I enrolled in was housed in a part of the state university that smelled like old carpet and printer toner, and had classrooms that were heated inconsistently, and professors who had actual mud on their boots from actual fieldwork. The students came from everywhere, not the curated everywhere of a private institution that considers diversity a feature to display in its brochures, but actual everywhere, the unglamorous and varied kind, people who were the first in their families, and people who had changed directions midway through other careers, and people who had been working in related fields for years and wanted the credentials to go with what they already knew. I loved it in a way I hadn't expected, not because it was easy. It wasn't. The coursework was harder than anything I'd encountered at Harlow Prep, which had given me tools without giving me context, had handed me technical proficiency without teaching me what it was for. Urban planning required me to think about systems and people simultaneously, to understand how the physical organization of a city affected the lives of the people who lived in it, in ways that were both immediate and generational. It required me to think about land, who owned it, who had access to it, who was displaced by its development, who benefited from its appreciation in value. I was, for the first time in years, interested. My first-year roommate was a student named Elijah Sterling, who had grown up on a farm in the eastern part of the state, and who was studying environmental engineering. He was methodical and quiet, and kept his half of the room organized with a precision that matched mine, and we got along almost entirely without discussing it. A compatibility of habits that was, I think, the closest thing to effortless friendship I have ever experienced. He was the person I told eventually about Harlow Prep. Not everything, not Cameron's name or the classroom incident in precise detail, but the shape of it, the scholarship, the lab work, the sense of being permitted to be somewhere rather than belonging there. He listened without interjecting, which is rarer than people think, and then he said, "I've never been somewhere I felt like I wasn't supposed to be, but I think I understand what that does to you." He was right. He understood more than I had given him, which is how understanding sometimes works. I was a different student at university than I had been at Harlow Prep. Not dramatically, visibly different. I was still quiet, still methodical, still careful about how much of myself I offered to any given situation. But I had stopped making myself smaller. I had stopped managing the space I occupied, according to what I thought other people's comfort required. I was not large or loud or performatively ambitious. I was just present, actually present. I did well. First year, then second, then year, then third. I developed genuine expertise in land use regulation and zoning policy, which is not the most glamorous corner of urban planning, but is, I would argue, the most consequential one. I worked 2 part-time jobs throughout my undergraduate years, one at a printing and reprographics shop that served the university's architecture and engineering departments, one as a research assistant for a professor named Dr. Chambers, who was studying the long-term economic effects of urban green space development. Both jobs were useful. The first kept me financially solvent and gave me practical familiarity with technical drawing and presentation that would matter later. The second gave me access to research and to a professional network that I spent the first several years being too intimidated to use properly. This was the second phase of my strategic mistake, which began at Harlow Prep and continued here. I consistently underestimated the value of the network I was building and consistently failed to invest in it with the intentionality it deserved. I knew people who were doing important work in the fields adjacent to mine. I attended conferences where I met other researchers, planners, and policy advocates. I participated enough to be present, but I held back from the relationships that might have developed from that presence if I had pursued them with more than minimal effort. I told myself I was focused on the work, that the relationships would follow from the work naturally, that I didn't need to cultivate connections the way the people who had gone to schools like Harlow Prep had been taught to cultivate them. Through family networks and club memberships and the particular social infrastructure of privilege that operates mostly invisibly unless you've grown up outside it. But focus on the work was partly also just. It was easier. Relationships required a kind of openness I had not fully recovered since that day in the classroom, and I did not fully know that yet. I graduated with honors. My thesis was on the relationship between zoning variance patterns and long-term neighborhood economic stability, and it was cited in a policy brief published by the city's Urban Development Office 2 years after I submitted it. Dr. Chambers recommended me for a position at a sustainable development consulting firm on the west side of the city. I took it. I was 23 years old. I had 2 part-time jobs worth of savings, a used car that ran reliably, a room in a house I shared with 2 other people from the university, and a feeling that I was, finally, moving towards something rather than away from it. Then my grandmother got sick. It happened over about 14 months. She was 81. The diagnosis was a form of progressive heart failure that the doctors managed conservatively at first, and then, as it advanced, could no longer meaningfully slow. She was never in dramatic crisis. It was not the kind of illness that produces emergency room scenes or sudden turns. It was the kind that slowly and steadily reduces someone, the way a river slowly and steadily changes the shape of a bank. She got smaller, she moved more carefully, she required more help. I was the person who provided most of it. My mother had her own health challenges by this point, a chronic back condition that limited how much she could lift or stand for extended periods. My father was still working, still reliable, but he was 62, and the physical nature of his work had accumulated in his joints over the decades in ways that were impossible to ignore. My grandmother had no other children. She had a small circle of church friends who visited, a neighbor who brought food twice a week, and me. I adjusted my work schedule. The consulting firm I worked for was run by a woman named Valerie Langston, who had, over the years I had been there, become someone I respected more than almost anyone I had professionally encountered. She understood, without my needing to explain it in detail, that I was managing something serious. She shifted my project load to accommodate remote work where possible, and gave me the flexibility I needed without making it a formal accommodation that required paperwork and policy review. That kind of practical private generosity is its own thing, distinct from institutional benevolence, and I have not forgotten it. I drove to my grandmother's house 3 evenings per week and all day Saturday. I learned how to manage her medication schedule, how to talk to her cardiologist, how to navigate the specific bureaucracy of home healthcare services in ways that were neither efficient nor intuitive. I learned what she could and couldn't eat, what physical activities remained feasible, what kinds of help she would accept without feeling diminished by it. We talked more in those 14 months than we had in all the years before combined. She talked about the land, not constantly, not in the way of someone with a fixed idea, but it came up, the way important things come up, in the gaps between other topics. She had been approached twice in the last 18 months, she told me, once by a development company whose name I didn't recognize, and once by a representative of a firm called Prescott Commercial Properties, which I did recognize. Though I said nothing about this at the time, both had made offers she described as reasonable without being compelling. They want to build something there that makes them money, she said. That's fine. That's what they do. But that corner doesn't need another thing that makes someone money. It needs something that makes the people who live around it better off. I asked her what she had in mind. She looked at me with the specific patience of someone who is waiting for you to arrive at an answer you already have access to. You know what that neighborhood needs, she said. You've studied it. You've studied every neighborhood like it. You don't need me to tell you. She was right. I knew the district around her land as well as I knew anywhere in the city. I had used data from that area in my thesis, had tracked its development patterns and demographic shifts and zoning history as part of the broader research I'd done under Dr. Chambers. I knew the lack of affordable childcare options in a 4-block radius. I knew the food access gaps. I knew the educational resources that had been absorbed or consolidated or defunded over the past decade. I knew the green space deficit, a city planning metric that quantifies, in acres per 1,000 residents, how much public natural space a neighborhood has access to, and I knew that her corner of the district was measurably below the city's own stated targets. I knew what the land could become. I just had not yet understood that this was my problem to solve. She died on a Thursday in late November, in her own bed, with the particular dignity that she had arranged for herself in the way she had arranged everything. Quietly, in advance, with attention to detail. The reading of the will took place in a lawyer's office on a Tuesday morning. The lawyer was a man I had spoken to once before, when helping my grandmother update some documents the previous year. He was organized and clear, and delivered the terms of the will without editorializing, which I appreciated. My grandmother had left me the land. She had also left me, in a separate account I had not known about, a sum of money she described in the accompanying letter as not enough to do it alone, but enough to begin. It was enough to begin. It was enough, combined with 5 years of my own careful saving and the equity in a small condo I had purchased 2 years earlier in a part of the city that had appreciated steadily to serve as meaningful seed capital. The condition of the inheritance was stated in writing, witnessed, and legally enforceable. The land must be developed into something that demonstrably benefits the surrounding community. It must not be sold to private interests for exclusively commercial residential development. It must include public access components. The specific form of development was left to my judgment, contingent on my being the one to execute it. I drove from the lawyer's office to the land itself and stood on the sidewalk across the street from it for a long time. It was not much to look at. It was a rectangular lot with a chain-link fence around it, and some scrub growth in the corners, and the particular quality of urban vacancy, the sense that a thing has been waiting without expectation. But I looked at it the way I had learned, in 5 years of professional practice, to look at land. Not as what it is, but as what it is capable of becoming, given the right confluence of vision, capital, regulation, and will. What I saw was a community hub, mixed use, affordable residential units on upper floors, ground level split, between commercial and public service tenants, a child care center, a small branch of the public library system, a community health clinic, an educational programming space, a rooftop garden, a small publicly accessible green space along the street frontage, sustainable design throughout, solar panels, gray water recycling, green roof insulation. I saw it completely and immediately, the way you see things when you have been preparing for them without knowing it. I also knew it would be enormously complicated to execute. I knew because I had been working in this field for 5 years, and because I knew specifically what was happening in that district, and because what was happening involved a family name I had not yet said out loud in the context of this particular problem. The Prescott name had been visible in the city's development landscape for as long as I could remember, but it had been invisible to me as a personal fact for nearly 8 years, the distance between high school and this moment. Cameron's father ran Prescott Commercial Properties. Cameron himself had apparently joined the firm after his own education, completing some version of the trajectory that schools like Harlow Prep existed specifically to produce. I found out, through a combination of public records research and professional industry contacts, that Prescott Commercial Properties had been quietly accumulating parcels in the district around my grandmother's land for 18 months. They had purchased 3 adjacent properties. They had filed preliminary zoning variance applications with the city. They had engaged a lobbying firm that worked with the City Planning Commission. They had, according to a colleague of mine who worked in the city's Development Review Office, proposed a large, mixed-use commercial complex that would occupy most of the southern face of the block where my grandmother's land sat. A project that, if approved, would require the relocation of dozens of long-term residents, the closure of several small businesses that had operated in the area for a decade or more, and the conversion of the block to a largely market-rate commercial and residential mix with minimal public benefit components. My grandmother's plot sat at what a zoning lawyer I consulted described, with notable precision, as a jurisdictional pivot point. Its location at a corner that bordered 2 different zoning classification areas meant that any large-scale development in the block would require either incorporating the plot or obtaining variances that accounted for it. Prescott's project, as proposed, needed either my land or a zoning accommodation that was by no means guaranteed. Without either, the project as planned could not proceed at its intended scale. I had not inherited leverage. I had inherited an obligation, and the obligation happened to carry leverage as a consequence. I want to be very clear about this distinction because it matters to me. I did not buy or earn or strategically acquire the position I was in. My grandmother had held that land for 40 years because she believed in holding it and because she had paid attention to her neighborhood and because she was, in the specific way of people who have built something carefully over a very long time, a person of vision. What I inherited from her was not just property. It was the accumulated patience of a woman who had known what she was holding and why. I owed her the same seriousness. The next 18 months were the period I sometimes think of, when I'm being very honest with myself, as the time I became someone different. Not dramatically, not in any way that was visible to the people around me, but the person who sat across the desk from Valerie Langston in her office on a Tuesday afternoon and said he needed to take a leave of absence to pursue an independent development project was not quite the same person who had sat in that same office 5 years earlier. Careful and deferential and grateful in a way that edged sometimes toward apology. Something had shifted in my center of gravity. I had a vision, a legal mandate, seed capital, and a jurisdictional position that gave me what the zoning lawyer called material leverage, and what I thought of privately as the ability to be a problem for Prescott unless I chose to be something more interesting than a problem. The work was procedural and relentless and in its own way, deeply satisfying. I spent the first 3 months doing nothing except research, documentation, and consultation. I mapped every existing development proposal in the district. I identified every applicable zoning regulation, every variance request, every pending application. I read the city's comprehensive urban development plan, which was a document of 312 pages that I do not believe any single person in the City Planning Commission had read from front to back, and I found in it, quietly, precisely documented, language that specifically prioritized community benefit requirements in mixed-use development projects in districts that met certain demographic and infrastructure criteria. My district met those criteria. Prescott's project, as filed, did not adequately address those requirements. This was not a technicality. This was the difference between what the city said it valued and what it had been permitting to happen on the ground for years. A gap that exists in most cities and that most developers exploit simply by being more present in the process than the communities being developed, who have less time and fewer resources, and whose voices are most audible after the damage is already done. I was going to be more present in the process. I brought in 3 collaborators. The first was Natalie Chambers. No relation to my former professor, just a coincidence of last names that I mention only because it is true, who was a community land trust specialist I had met at a conference 2 years earlier. I had been too hesitant to cultivate that connection at the time, and it had taken an awkward email and a longer than expected response time to reestablish contact. But she came in, and she was excellent, and she knew how to structure a development project in a way that built in permanent affordability protections rather than the kind of time-limited affordability agreements that developers routinely propose and that expire just as the properties become most valuable. The second was Maxwell Gibson, a financing specialist who worked with a network of what he called patient capital investors, foundations, community development financial institutions, socially oriented family offices, whose investment timelines and return expectations were different from traditional commercial real estate investment. He had heard about the project through Natalie and reached out to me directly. He was specific and unsentimental about what the financing structure would require and what it would produce, and that specificity was exactly what the project needed. The third was Lauren Harlow. I noted the last name and said nothing. A communications consultant who had spent 8 years working with community organizations and whose role was to do something I had been entirely neglecting: talk to the people who actually lived and worked in the district. This was the third thing I had been getting wrong for most of my professional life, and I see it now with a clarity that I did not have then. I had treated the community around my grandmother's land as the beneficiary of my vision rather than as participants in it. I had been designing something for people rather than with them, and Lauren made this clear to me within the first week of her engagement with remarkable directness that I found both uncomfortable and necessary. "These are the people who have been displaced before," she said, sitting across from me in the office space I had rented, a spare room above a dry cleaner's that cost less per month than the parking space in my building downtown had cost. They have been promised things before, a community center here, affordable housing there, and then the developers got the approvals they needed and the affordable units turned out to be 6 studios on the 4th floor of a 14-story luxury residential building. They are not going to believe you based on what you say. They're going to need to see the legal documents. They're going to need to see your name on something binding. I know, I said. Do you actually know? She said. Because knowing and operationalizing are different things. I operationalized it. We held 15 community meetings in the district over the following 4 months. Not one large public hearing, which tends to produce performances rather than conversations, but 15 smaller gatherings in church basements and library meeting rooms, and the back room of a Dominican restaurant that had been on that block since 1998. We brought the legal documents. We brought the actual architectural renderings, which we had commissioned from a firm that Natalie recommended, run by a pair of designers named Morgan Caldwell and Paige Thornton, who had extensive experience with sustainable mixed-use community development, and who produced something that was both visionary and legible to people who were not architects. We asked what people needed. We documented what they said. We revised the design based on what they told us. We went back with the revised design and asked again. The child care center moved from the 2nd floor to the ground floor because parents with young children told us, with simple directness, that 2nd floor child care didn't work when you were running late with a stroller and a bag and a toddler who wouldn't get in the elevator. The health clinic expanded to include mental health services because 3 different people in 3 different meetings mentioned, without prompting, that there was no affordable mental health provider within a reasonable distance of the neighborhood. The educational programming space was redesigned to accommodate adult education and workforce training, after a woman who had been a school administrator told us that literacy and job skill programs for adults were the unmet need in the district, not after-school programs, which were already being served reasonably well by a community organization 2 blocks over. I went to every meeting, I took notes, I revised, I came back. By the time we filed our formal development proposal with the City Planning Commission, we had documentation of community engagement that was, according to the zoning lawyer, unlike anything she had submitted in 11 years of practice in this city. Not because it was long, though it was, but because it was specific. Named individuals with named needs and documented responses. A record of revision and accountability that demonstrated not just consultation but actual incorporation of community input into the design. The proposal landed on the Commission's docket on a Thursday. On Friday, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. The message was from Cameron Prescott. I listened to it 3 times. His voice had changed, or maybe I had changed, and so I heard it differently. The confidence was still there, but it had the texture of something being carefully maintained rather than something natural. He said my name, my full name, in a way that suggested he had practiced saying it, had prepared himself to acknowledge me as a person with a full name, rather than a category with a minimal designation. He said he had been made aware that we were both involved in development proposals affecting the same district. He said he thought it would be beneficial for us to meet. He said he hoped we could find a solution that worked for all stakeholders. He used the word stakeholders. He said it would be great to reconnect. I put my phone down on the desk. I sat with the message for a long time, not because I was uncertain about what I wanted to do, but because I wanted to understand precisely what I was feeling, and what I was feeling was complex. There was satisfaction in it, yes. I won't pretend there wasn't. Hearing Cameron Prescott call my name in a careful voice, hearing the effort he was making to frame his outreach as collegial rather than desperate, knowing that the careful positioning I had done over the previous 18 months had produced this call. There was something in that I recognized as the thing I had stored in my kitchen at 16, waiting. But there was also something else, something I had not anticipated. The satisfaction was not as clean as I had expected. It was mixed with an awareness that everything I had built, the project, the community support, the financing structure, the regulatory positioning, existed partly because of what Cameron had done to me in that classroom 13 years earlier, that his contempt had shaped my discipline, that his dismissal had informed my choices in ways I could not fully separate from the choices themselves, that I was, in some fundamental way, still organized around what he had said about me. That didn't feel like victory, not entirely. It felt like the beginning of an accounting. I did not return the call. The project moved through the regulatory process with the particular pace of these things, which is to say slowly and with procedural intervals that require patience I had spent years building. The commission reviewed our filing. They requested additional documentation on 3 specific technical points, which we provided within 2 weeks. They scheduled a public comment period, which we used to present 3 months of community engagement records to a room that included several members of the city council and, I noted, representatives from Prescott Commercial Properties who sat in the back row with their legal pads and their very controlled expressions. The public comment hearing was 5 hours long. The community members who spoke were specific and prepared. A woman who had run a small tailoring business in the district for 17 years talked about what it would mean to have affordable commercial space that wasn't subject to market-rate rent increases. A man who had been teaching reading skills to adults at his church for the past decade talked about the educational programming space. A pediatric nurse practitioner from the neighborhood talked about the health clinic gap. A woman who had brought her 2-year-old to the meeting talked about the child care. None of them mentioned Cameron Prescott or his family's project explicitly. They talked about what they needed. That was enough. The commissioners asked questions. I answered them. Natalie answered technical questions about the land trust, structure. Maxwell answered questions about the financing. Morgan presented the architectural drawings and explained the sustainability components. The solar panels, the gray water system, the green roof, the stormwater management features that the city's own environmental standards had been calling for in new development applications since 2019. At the end of the hearing, the commission chair, a woman who had been on the commission for 11 years, and whom I had met twice in professional context before this process, said that the proposal demonstrated what she described as a level of community integration and procedural rigor that should be a model for future mixed-use development applications. She didn't look at the Prescott representatives when she said it. They didn't need her to. 3 weeks after the hearing, the commission issued its findings. Our project received approval with one minor modification, a technical adjustment to the ground floor, commercial space allocation that we had anticipated and already had a design response for. Prescott Commercial Properties project received conditional approval, contingent on modifications that included a 30% reduction in the commercial footprint, the addition of mandated affordable housing units above the city's standard inclusion rate, a community benefit fund contribution of a specified amount to be administered by an independent board, and design revisions to include public green space along the street frontage adjacent to our project. The Prescott project, as conditionally approved, was a fundamentally different project from the one they had filed. It was not destroyed. I want to be honest about that. They retained a meaningful development, and they would profit from it. But its scale had been reduced, its character had been changed, and the new standards it had been forced to adopt, the affordable units, the community benefit contribution, the green space requirements, had been directly influenced by the presence of our project and the regulatory conversation our project had forced. Our land had changed the rules, just as my grandmother had known it would. The groundbreaking ceremony was on a Saturday in early spring. Valerie Langston was there. Natalie was there. Maxwell was there. Lauren was there, standing with several of the community members she had interviewed over the previous year. Morgan and Paige were there with rolled-up drawings under their arms. Jonathan Bennett, who I had looked up somewhat impulsively a few months earlier, and who had become a secondary school teacher in the city, and who had, when I called him, been warm and genuinely glad to hear from me, was there with his wife. Dr. Rivera was there. I had found her contact information through the Harlow Prep Alumni Network, had sent her a brief email explaining the project and extending an invitation. She had responded within an hour. She stood near the edge of the gathered group and watched everything with the same specific attention she had brought to AP Environmental Science class 20 years ago. And when I caught her eye before the formal remarks began, she nodded in a way that contained everything she might have said about the room, laughing, about the logbook in my hand, about the fact that she had known then and she was watching now. I gave brief remarks. I talked about my grandmother and what she had understood about land and community and patience. I talked about what the project was designed to do: the housing, the child care, the clinic, the educational space, the green space, the sustainability infrastructure. I talked about the community members who had shaped the design and whose names were, in a very real sense, written into the architecture of the place. I did not talk about Harlow Prep. I did not say Cameron Prescott's name. I did not perform anything about the distance I had traveled from any previous version of my life. I talked about what we were building and why. The moment Cameron Prescott understood what had happened came approximately 2 weeks before the groundbreaking, in an encounter I had not engineered and had not sought. We were both at a reception hosted by the city's Urban Planning Association, an annual event I attended partly because Valerie had always encouraged professional visibility, and partly because I had, over the years, built enough genuine relationships in that community that these gatherings were no longer performances of presence, but actual occasions for professional connection. I had not known Cameron would be there. It was possible he had not known I would be there. I saw him across the room about 20 minutes after I arrived. He was talking to someone I recognized as a commercial real estate broker. He was still physically similar to how I remembered him, the posture of someone who has always known they belong in a room, but there was something different in the way he held it, a slight tension maybe, the particular quality of confidence that is working harder than it used to. He saw me see him, and for a moment neither of us moved. Then he crossed the room. He extended his hand. I shook it. His grip was firm in the way of someone who has been told that a firm handshake is important. "It's been a long time," he said. "It has," I said. "Your project is impressive." He said it with a tone that was attempting to be collegial, to suggest that we were peers assessing each other's work with professional respect. But underneath the tone, there was something that was not quite concession and not quite shame, and was actually, I think, something more uncomfortable than either. It was the look of someone who understood, for the first time fully, that they had been looking in the wrong direction for a long time. "Thank you," I said. "I think what you've done with the community engagement process especially, Safir," he started. "Cameron." I said his name gently but with a precision that stopped him. "We don't need to do this." He looked at me. I looked back. "I hope the project goes well for your family," I said. And I meant it. I meant it in the complicated way that you mean things when they are true and when they are also the end of something. I wasn't wishing him harm. I wasn't taunting him. I was being accurate. I hoped his project, reduced and modified and community benefit compliant as it now was, went well for him, because his project being functional was compatible with my project doing what it needed to do, and because I had stopped somewhere along the way, needing his failure in order to feel my own success. I shook his hand again once. Then I turned and walked toward the group of people I'd actually come to see. He did not try to follow. The building took 21 months to complete. It went over budget twice for reasons that were structural and largely unavoidable, and each time Maxwell navigated the financing with a patience and creativity that I observed closely and learned from. There were permit delays and contractor disputes and a labor shortage in the spring of the second year that pushed the timeline by 3 months. There were weeks when the work felt impossibly slow and weeks when something came together with an efficiency that made me believe, briefly, in momentum. I was on site regularly. I had not planned to be. I had hired a construction manager, a reliable and experienced woman named Allison Davenport, who had worked on community development projects for 15 years and whose site management was impeccable. She didn't need me there, but I was there anyway, 2 or 3 mornings a week, standing on the perimeter or walking through the interior in whatever state it was in that particular week. Frame, then rough plumbing, then electrical, then the slow accumulation of walls and ceilings and systems that turns a structure into a building. My father came once. He stood in what would become the child care center and looked at the ceiling height and the windows and said, without any particular sentimentality, "This is a good room." He ran his hand along the edge of a support column the way he ran his hand along the frame of a car he was assessing. Good bones. I thought about him a lot during those months, about the word reliable and what he had built his life around, about the ways I was similar to him that I had not wanted to acknowledge when I was younger, and that I could see clearly now. The patience, the attention to structure, the conviction that the work itself was what mattered. My mother came and took photographs of everything, which she organized into a binder that she gave me at the groundbreaking, with the particular satisfaction of a woman who documents things, because documentation is its own form of permanence. The opening ceremony was on a Saturday in autumn, 18 months after the groundbreaking. The building was not everything I had imagined. It was better in some ways and less than I had hoped in others. And this is how built things always are. The gap between vision and execution is neither a failure nor a success, but simply the cost of bringing something from the mind into the world. The child care center had 13 children enrolled before the doors opened, with a waiting list of 22. The health clinic had contracted with the county to provide a full suite of primary care services, including the mental health component, and had already hired 2 full-time physicians and 4 nurse practitioners from within the district. The educational programming space had 4 adult literacy sessions scheduled per week, 2 financial literacy workshops per month, and a partnership with the community college for continuing education credits. The library branch had a collection of 40,000 volumes, a digital resource center, a programming room for children's events, and a librarian named Charles Whitfield, who had been advocating for a branch in this district for 7 years, and who, when he walked through the space on opening day, put his hand over his mouth and stood there for a long moment before saying anything. The rooftop garden had been planted the previous month by a group of 32 community members, including 11 children, under the guidance of a community horticulturist and 2 volunteers from a local urban agriculture nonprofit. It was not fully established yet. Plants need time, but the beds were filled and the irrigation lines were live, and in another year it would look like what it was supposed to look like. The green space along the street frontage had 3 benches, 2 trees, a small area of grass, and a low planting border that the landscape architect described as seasonally dynamic, which meant something would always be in bloom or in color. It was small. It was also the only public green space in a 6-block radius. I stood at the opening with a group of people who had been there for parts of the journey at various distances, and I watched families come through the door and children run toward the garden, and an elderly man sit down on one of the street benches with the deliberate satisfaction of someone who has been waiting for a place to sit down. Dr. Rivera stood beside me for a while. She didn't say much. At some point she said quietly, "The poster board was right, you know. I knew it then." I didn't say anything back. I didn't need to. There is a thing that happens to people who spend a long time organized around a wound, and I want to talk about it honestly, because it is the part of this story that is hardest to tell and most important to understand. When you are hurt in the particular way I was hurt, not violently, not catastrophically, but systematically and precisely in the specific ways that a person is hurt when they are made, to feel that their presence in a space is conditional, that their competence is suspicious, that the room laughing is a verdict rather than an embarrassment. You adapt. The adaptation is intelligent, and the adaptation saves you. It gives you the patience to wait, the discipline to build, the capacity to hold things without spending them before their time, but the adaptation also costs you. I was, at the time of the opening ceremony, 34 years old. I had built something I was genuinely proud of. I was professionally respected. I had financial stability for the first time in my adult life, modest but real. I had people around me who mattered to me. Natalie, Maxwell, Lauren, Valerie, Elijah, Jonathan, my parents, who were aging but present and who had, at different moments in the preceding year, expressed a pride in me that I had not known how to receive gracefully and that I was still learning how to hold. But I had also, over 18 years, built walls that had served their purpose so thoroughly that I was no longer sure where the walls ended and where I began. I did not know how to let people in the way that would have required me to stop managing my exposure. I did not know how to receive care without scanning it for conditions. I did not know how to be in a room without monitoring the exits. I had become someone who was excellent at the long game and not particularly good at Tuesday. I recognized this about myself, the way you recognize a familiar piece of furniture in a room you're trying to rearrange, not with surprise exactly, but with the particular exhaustion of understanding that moving it will require effort you've been deferring. The victory was real. I want to say that clearly. The building was real. The community in it was real. The families in the child care center were real. The adults learning to read in the programming space were real. The person sitting on the bench outside was real. What we built would be there for decades. It would outlast me and outlast Cameron Prescott and outlast the version of this story that I have been carrying since I was 16. That was real. But winning had not made me the person I might have been if I had never needed to win. And understanding that distinction, the gap between the person you became in order to survive and the person you might have been in a kinder set of circumstances, that's not something that goes away when the opening ceremony ends and the families go home and you're standing on the sidewalk in the autumn afternoon in front of the thing you built. It just becomes something you know. 2 months after the opening, I received an email from Cameron Prescott. It was long, it was carefully written. It acknowledged, in language that had clearly been drafted and redrafted, the incident in Dr. Rivera's classroom. It characterized what he had done as a reflection of his own insecurity and immaturity, which I believe was true because it usually is. When people do those things, and immaturity has never struck me as an excuse for behavior, but it is sometimes an explanation, and there is a difference. He said that watching the project develop, the community engagement, the design, the opening, had made him think about things he had not allowed himself to think about for a long time. He did not ask for forgiveness explicitly. He said he wanted me to know that he understood now, what he hadn't then. He said he hoped we might have coffee sometime. I read the email twice. The first time I felt the old sharpness, the reflex, the stored posture of someone who has been told to be on guard. The second time I felt something else. Not warmth exactly, Not the kind of resolution that would mean the door was open, but something that was adjacent to completeness, the particular feeling of a loop that has closed. I did not reply, not because I wanted to punish him, not because I was still angry in any active sense, but because I had spent 8 years building something that had nothing to do with him, and the most honest thing I could do was to let that be true. Giving him the coffee would have made me part of his narrative, his growth, his reckoning, his account of the person he had become. And I was not interested in being part of that narrative. I had my own. The email stayed unanswered in my inbox for a while, and then I archived it, the way I archive things that no longer required action, but that I was not ready to delete. I think about my grandmother often. I think about the afternoon she told me that land doesn't ask you for anything. I think about the specific quality of patience she had. Not passive, not resigned, but purposeful. The patience of someone who is working on a timeline longer than the immediate. She had held that land for 40 years, and she had known, I believe, approximately what she was holding it for. She had not told me this in explicit terms, but she had told me enough, and she had trusted that I would arrive at the understanding I needed when I needed it. I think about what it meant that the building she enabled, the building on her corner, at the junction she had owned and tended for 4 decades, was shaped by everything that had happened to me, between her and the classroom and the university and the firm, and the 18 months of meetings in church basements. I was shaped by the humiliation. I would be lying if I said otherwise. The discipline, the patience, the capacity to hold a long-term strategy without spending it early, all of that was built partly in response to what Cameron did in that classroom. And the building on my grandmother's corner carries, in its bones, the architecture of that shaping. I'm not at peace with this in the way that certain kinds of stories want their narrators to be at peace with things. The resolution is not the unclenching of a fist. It is something more like the acknowledgement that the fist was real, that what it was protecting was real, and that having held it so long you've forgotten what it felt like to have that hand open. I am working on that. Not in the way that suggests it will be resolved into something clean, but in the way that suggests it is a real project with a real duration, like any development that is worth doing. Valerie Langston retired from the firm last year. At her retirement dinner, she said something that I've kept with me. She said, "The best projects are the ones that change what's possible for everyone in the space, not just the people who commission them." She was talking about urban development. She was also, I think, talking about something else, though she did not say so directly. The district around my grandmother's land has changed since the building opened. Not dramatically, not in the way that gentrification changes a neighborhood, that particular violence of improvement that displaces the very people it claims to benefit, but in smaller ways that accumulate. 3 new small businesses have opened in the commercial spaces on the block, including a cafe run by a family that had been in the district for 12 years and had never had a storefront. The library branch has the highest monthly attendance of any branch in the county system. 2 of the women who completed adult literacy programming in the educational center are now enrolled in the community college partnership. The rooftop garden produced its first harvest last summer. One of the children who planted it with her school group 9 months earlier came back with her class for a harvest event and was photographed holding a tomato with an expression of absolute astonishment that something she had put in the ground had become something real. I was there for that. I had not planned to be. I happened to be on site for a maintenance review, and I came up to the rooftop and saw the children and stood at the edge of the garden and watched, and it was one of the few moments in the preceding several years that I can describe as uncomplicated. Not resolved, not healed, but uncomplicated. The child held up the tomato. Her teacher photographed it. The garden existed. My grandmother had been right about what the corner was waiting to become. I had been right about needing more than half my life to become the person who could do something about it. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and the space between them is where I live. I am standing at the corner of my grandmother's land. The building rises behind me, 5 floors, the solar panels visible on the roofline, the green frontage with its second-year plantings filling in the way plants do when they have been given time and intention. Inside, the child care center has children. The library has people reading. The clinic has a woman in the waiting room filling out intake forms for her first primary care appointment in 4 years. The educational programming space has an adult literacy session that started 20 minutes ago. I'm standing here the way she used to stand in her kitchen, in the particular stillness of someone who knows what they've done with what they were given. Cameron Prescott's project sits 2 blocks over. It is functional. It is reduced from what it was supposed to be. It carries, in its modified design, the permanent trace of what our project forced it to accommodate. His family will make money from it. The affordable units will be occupied. The Community Benefit Fund will disperse its allocations. These are not the outcomes I would have designed from the beginning, but they are better outcomes than the original plan would have produced, and the distinction matters. I won. I know that. I knew it before the building was finished. I knew it before the groundbreaking. I knew it in the specific way you know things you cannot yet articulate. When I listened to Cameron Prescott's voicemail 3 weeks before the commission hearing and heard the careful effort in his voice and understood that effort for what it was. But winning changed me in the way that winning always changes people who spend too long making it necessary. I am sharper than I needed to be, and more defended than is useful, and better at the long game than at the ordinary day. I have relationships that are real, and that I value, and that I've had to work, sometimes consciously and effortfully, to keep myself open enough to maintain. I have a life that is genuinely mine, built on foundations that I understand and believe in. I also have the memory of a classroom and the sound of people laughing, and the feeling of something closing quietly in the warm, fluorescent air. And I carry that with me, the way you carry something that has been part of you so long you can no longer imagine the shape of yourself without it. My grandmother's land became something that benefits the community. I became the person who made sure it did. Whether the second thing required the first thing, the classroom, the humiliation, the 18 years of carrying and storing and disciplining and waiting, I genuinely do not know. I suspect not. I suspect there were other possible paths. I suspect that if Cameron had not said what he said, or if the room had not laughed, or if I had not closed something in myself that afternoon, and then spent years obeying the closure, I might have arrived at something similar by a different route, with less cost, and with a hand more accustomed to being open. But I cannot know that. You cannot reconstruct the road not taken. You can only stand on the road you are on and look at what you built, and understand what it cost you, and decide, going forward, whether the thing you became in order to build it is still who you need to be. I am not sure yet. I'm working on that too. The building is real. The corner is changed. The child's tomato was real. That is enough. For now, it is enough. I turn away from the building and walk toward my car. The day is ordinary and cool. There are people on the sidewalk going about the ordinary work of their lives. The light at the corner changes, and I wait for it, standing in the city my grandmother knew, and I know, and that the children in the child care center behind me will one day leave and return to, and perhaps, in their own way, build. I wait for the light. It changes. I walk.